It is a pleasure to introduce to you Jack Halberstam, also known as Judith Halberstam, and Jack is here for the second time in less than 3 months. So we are very grateful to have, to be so lucky as to have you here and to be able to enjoy the seminar. We are doing a seminar with Jack, and a 4-day seminar. We are finishing tomorrow, and we are reading a lot. We are watching lots of films as well, because the seminar is actually I think a way to bring to us your what I read as your idea of love theory as well, which is a way to fight against high theory, against the imposition of a certain type of knowledge. And this is not what I have prepared that I was going to say, but this is what comes to me just now out of everything, that all the input that you've given us. I think your methodology, the methodology that Jack has been using to actually make us dialogue with the readings that we do, with our own perceptions of the readings, and with our own interpretations of the films, classic documentaries such as Paris is Burning, and the newest films about queer theory or the representation of queer culture, such as the one that we are going to watch tomorrow, Tangerine, is just, unique. So, as you know, Jack is the author of the very famous Female Masculinity, of the art of the queer art of failure. And the queer art of failure is about this as well. It's just about how we can oppose those forms of knowledge by holding on to failure and to what is often considered minor forms of popular culture. The book that you just published is Trans, a quick and quirky account of gender variability, which is being published now in 2018. And the book talks about recent shifts in the meaning of the gendered body, and how the gendered body can be a site for political activism. I think what I will highlight there is how how we can actually politicize our fights and also do a sort of socio-political anarchy in the way that we focus on our gendered bodies. And today Jack's going to talk about histories, bodies, and the unbuilding of worlds. And what I will highlight from there, that you're obviously going to talk and you're going to give us all your ideas on that, but perhaps what really attracts me about the description is the idea of unbecoming of disorder, the disorder of things. And so if there is an order of things, there is also a disorder of things. How can we find ourselves there? How can we prevail in that disorder? And I think this is the summary. I have something very well prepared here with lots of things that I wanted to say. Of course, Jack is a professor at Columbia University, professor of gender studies, literary theory, comparative literatures, English, so visual culture, so just name it. And it's also here, this is, I want to say that as well, the personal note, because the personal is certainly very, very political, and the way that we relate to the people that we meet, and the way that we are constructing relations through the GEMMA community, and now with Jack, who's part of the GEMMA community now, and all of you here. It's just the personal note is, I approached Jack last year because lots of people in the GEMMA community and in the English studies department, and we're working on his books. And this was popular acclaim. People wanted Jack to come here. I approached Jack, and he immediately said yes. You didn't know us. Now you know us a little bit more, for the second time. But your generosity is just something which is, this is just an example of that, of that love way of, changing things. So thanks very much. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank Adelina for inviting me and hosting me and being an incredibly gracious interlocutor. I want to thank all the students in the seminar. We've been spending some really great time together last week and this week, and I'm really happy to be here, and I hope that it's meaningful because I'm really enjoying it. So I'll try to present for no more than about 40 minutes, okay, so that we can have lots of time for discussion. And I really have tailored this talk a little bit towards discussions that we've been having in the seminar, so that they are not disconnected from what I want to talk about tonight. And I'm going to do three things tonight, and they're sort of connected and sort of disconnected, but that's what it means to be disorderly as well, okay? In the first part of the talk, I want to give an alternative history of trans that runs through queer bodies of color that are not as easily read into the conventional history of the emergence of transsexual and transgender communities. By now we have very, very clear histories of that, mostly histories that focus on people like Christine Jorgensen, who was a Scandinavian woman who with Scandinavian origins, a beautiful, blonde, transsexual woman who had a very spectacular, mediatized sex change in, I think it was like 1956, that became the starting point, as far as these histories are concerned, of transsexual understandings of the body as transsexual. And that's a very particular history. I want to offer you an alternative history through a story that emerged this year in the New York Times that I'm going to tell you. So I'm going to tell you this alternative story. I'm going to read it into what Adelina just referred to as the disorder of things, a disorderly relationship to the production of identities. It's an identity that we're going to hear about that does not confirm male, female, trans, but in fact challenges these classifications of bodies and remains unknowable across the divide of history. In the second section, I want to put pressure on the way in which we have, in the contemporary period, scripted the relationship between transgender and feminism. And I want to give an alternative history of feminism's relationship to transgender. And then in the final section, to get into this idea of disorderliness in a really deep way, I want to, and all of this material is from the 1970s, refer to an aesthetic movement from the 1970s that was committed not to making a new world, but unmaking the world that we're in. So each example that I'm going to give you, the black queer/trans body in the first section, the trans feminist body in the middle section, and the art group that seeks to unmake worlds in the last section, all were from the 1970s and really precede what we understand to be this contemporary period of gender reclassification under the heading of trans. Okay, so that's kind of clear. So, it's interesting that it's the 1970s, because that was a time that follows on from the 1960s challenge to the status quo, the so-called sexual revolutions, the civil rights movement. The 1970s moves away, in fact, from civil rights kinds of narratives and digs deep into anarchy. And in each case, I want to point towards a kind of anarchistic relationship to knowledge, let's just say, to knowledge. So in the first section, let's call it wayward, and here I'm taking the term wayward. Wayward in English, it's actually a very beautiful word. What would the Spanish translation be? I mean,
no lo sé cómo lo
lost,
traduciríais.
someone who moves hacia adelante. Wayward. Someone who doesn't follow the normal path is wayward, or somebody who's out of line. Okay. So let's use this word, which I take from. Okay. Deviation. Yeah. Yeah. One who deviates from the norm. Wayward. I take it from a new book by Saidiya Hartman, where she writes about wayward black girls in the 1930s and 1940s. So that's where we're getting this category of the wayward. Okay, so I want to tell you a little story that appeared in the New York Times about a wayward body. Here, unclassifiable in terms of gender and sexuality. I mean, you don't really know, is this a man, is this a woman? And this is how this person enters into history, is as a mugshot in the New York City police files, that this picture was taken when this person got into trouble with the law for dealing drugs in the 1970s, was filed in the police records at that time, and with only the name AC. So AC doesn't tell you again if it's a man or a woman. So then, 5 years after this picture was taken, this person shows up dead, murdered, outside of New York City. Execution style, mafia style murder. And they take prints from their fingerprints and try to match them. And they can't, because this person's file has been misfiled by the New York City Police Department as a man. They've read this person as a man, filed their records with men, and therefore all of the records of this person are in the wrong place, and the police can't find them. So the body turns up murdered, and no one can find who is this person. So here's a body, literally lost to history, murdered, already classified by the police as a criminal, okay? So already in the system, but misgendered in the system, and therefore doubly lost. So, what happens here? In the New York Times a year and a half ago, a story appeared under the heading of Solved. Okay, so this crime has been resolved for us. The 47-year mystery of a murder victim's many identities. A murdered drug dealer dressed as a man, had lovers of both genders, and used several aliases, concealing her identity well past, we'll get to this, it comes up in another slide, well past her death. Okay, so the New York Times is really confused. They call this person she. They say that she dressed as a man, that she had lovers of both genders, and she used several aliases. So even though this is supposedly solved, right? Who is this person? Like, what identity is this? What do we actually know about this person? So, for me, the story was really odd. I mean, the whole thing caught my attention, and I read it, I reread it, I read it again. I was just like, I don't understand why they're even focusing on this. So why was it odd? Because the journalist, Wilson, was mostly focused on following the cold case, you know, and this is like a million TV shows about cold cases. This was a cold case in the files, and it had all of these, you know, flashy signifiers around bisexuality and cross-dressing. So the journalist decides to trace it, and he does the research for about 6 months, and finally he says, okay, I figured it out, I've solved it. So I want to show you what it means for a straight journalist to solve this case, and then we will try to leave the case open as unresolvable according to the categories available to us to make sense of this person, okay? So what does it mean for the journalist? The journalist just wants to get a name. They want to know, who is this person, how did they end up dead, and why was it so hard to trace them? What we want to do is use this person's history, case history, to apply pressure to the classification of knowledge that we're familiar with, and that is actually really challenged by these kinds of cases, within which you have somebody who dressed as a man, so has a sort of trans orientation, lovers of both genders, so isn't committed to just sleeping with men or sleeping with women, is engaged in criminality, crimes, but crimes for black people in Harlem in the 1970s is simply the only way to make a living, right? And then a murdered drug dealer. And by the way, the journalist never says who murdered that person. So solved is a matter of opinion. The point here for the journalist is never to find out who murdered this person, because this life is not, you know, what Butler would call a livable or a grievable life. This is just a life that we might be interested in knowing something about because it sounds so bizarre to us. So it's a spectacle. And we want to take it out of the realm of spectacle and use it to apply pressure to these very neat stories about transgenderism that we have in the press now, with Caitlyn Jenner, you know, beginning with Christine Jorgensen and ending with Caitlyn Jenner. Stories of elite, white, blonde, trans women who seem to magically transform from male to female and are extremely desirable to straight men, and then confirm the wonders of contemporary medicine and so on. Okay, so we're going to use this case to put pressure there. So here's the full sentence that we couldn't read properly. A murdered drug dealer dressed as a man had lovers of different genders and used several aliases, successfully concealing her identity even well past her death. Take a minute and look at this sentence. You know, if you need to take a second to translate it for yourself so you understand it. This is an incredible sentence. A murdered drug dealer dressed as a man. Let's take that piece. So this person is not masculine in their own right. They're dressed as a man. This person can't be just in clothing that they want to wear. Why can't this person be wearing a nice coat, wearing their hair short, dressing the way they want to dress? It doesn't look like they're dressed as a man. They just are a masculine person. Okay? Dressed as a man, had lovers of different genders, we'll get to that in a moment, used several different aliases, successfully concealing her identity well past her death. Suddenly this person is trying to fool everyone after they've been murdered. It's an incredible insinuation to make about somebody, that they are concealing their identity well past their death. Okay? So we're asked to see this person as an incredibly deceitful person who is committed to never giving up the truth of their identity in the way that the journalist wants there to be the truth. This is some of the police records that are available. Here, the prisoner obviously gave a completely fake name, Fanny Hill, that has no relationship to their actual name. Probably gave a wrong address. I don't really know what it says for occupation, etc. Okay, so and this is some of the material where the person gets misgendered and therefore gets lost in the police record. This is the grave that the person was given. It's when people are, they die without a clear sense of who they are. They're buried in a place called Potter's Fields, where they have anonymous graves. And the police records list them only as John or Jane Doe. But they don't know if this person is male or female. So this person has to go into history as J. Doe. Notice how even in death, a body has to be gendered. And there's no way of saying who they are other than Jane Doe or John Doe. Those are the names used in an American context for an anonymous body. So I want to use this case history to contribute to what Saidiya Hartman calls a counter-history of the human. And if we use Saidiya Hartman, and Saidiya Hartman is an amazing, very important theorist of what she calls the afterlife of slavery. She writes in one essay that the archives of both slavery and post-slavery are full of discontinuities, gaps and silences. And one of the things that she argues is that rather than trying to fill in the gaps and make up a story for who people are when we find that the archive doesn't tell us, we have to allow the archive to stand as incomplete. Okay, so if you allow the archive to stand as incomplete, then you admit that the archive has gaps and fissures and places where nothing is known, nothing can be known. And when you try to fill in the gaps, what you do is you return the wayward body into the normative classifications that body has eluded. You see? So a counter-history of the human refuses to simply place the body, take it out from the realm of the wayward, and place it neatly back in the archive. So Hartman proposes that we listen to the dead, not in terms of the frameworks provided by the law, the police, abolitionists, but in relationship to everything that the archive leaves out. And so, and I'm quoting here, she argues instead of narrative, excess, she argues for narrative restraint, hold back from telling normative stories about people in the way that this journalist does, and instead script them within what she calls a counter-history of the human. So we're going to do that by way of concluding this first section. That's what I want to do, is make this non-history, this untellable story, this irresolvable mystery, part of the counter-history of the human, and leave it in the realm of waywardness rather than pulling it into focus so that we feel better about the violence of the archive. So when mentioned at all in the New York Times story, the gender variance in this story functions as just a sensational detail that might catch the attention of a reader who otherwise doesn't really care about another cold case, another black body that goes missing in the 1970s and shows up murdered. So they use this kind of language about them. This person was a cross-dressing, gun-toting, bisexual heroin dealer in 1960s Harlem, and that's pulled out as a scare quote, so that you'll be like, what? Ooh, that sounds interesting, right? So the actual details of their life are just used as fodder, as a kind of spectacle for the white reader. Okay, in fact, the story is of an unidentifiable body, somebody who is permanently lost, somebody who we might potentially place in what we could call the queer undercommons, to use the category used by Fred Moten and Stefano Hani, and part of what Lisa Lowe would call an undocumented history. So how can we allow people to remain undocumented, to remain lost, to remain wayward? That's the question. This is what the journalist does. The journalist, in his story about this murdered genderqueer person, finally he finds a name that he can affix to this person using 4 arrest sheets and some census reports, and he tracks this person down to a family in South Carolina. Okay, and then uses the public records attached to that family to trace what's happened to this person's family, to try to then place them in a normative history, histories that work through families, and then communities, and then states, and then nation, and so on. But what the journalist finds is that of this person's family, no records remain. So now we're in a bigger dilemma, which is about the way in which black people's lives and deaths are barely even recorded in American history. This is just one random family, and most of the family is missing, and it cannot be traced either to a birth or to a death. This particular person, their birth certificate was their name was misspelled on their very birth certificate, making them an illegal person from birth. Okay, so that's how they come to be AC, is because the name on the birth certificate, the name on the ID, and the name on the police record, they're all different. Okay, the mother and father reported 0 income, to the extent that they have any kind of file, say reported 0 income. They had 4 children. Of those children, this is one. Another one is recorded, placed most of his life in a psychiatric institution, and the other 2 have disappeared without a trace. Okay? So this is the disordered nature of the black family in the U.S. in the 1970s. guaranteed other kinds of white families of maybe the same class background would not be so lost to public record as this person is. Other details include the journalist finds record that this person had been engaged in a relationship, a same-sex relationship, with a woman called Shirlene Dixon. And then the journalist breaks off from this story saying, quote, "In unrelated violence 5 years later, after this person had been involved with our gun-toting bisexual, Miss Dixon and her mother were murdered by the mother's boyfriend." And the journalist suggests that this was just unrelated violence, incidental violence. Okay, so do you see what I'm saying? This person was involved with a woman, and that woman dies 5 years later in a violent incident in which the person's mother and she were killed by the mother's boyfriend. Now the reason this is important, because it shows how punctuated by violence the quotidian everyday life of black people in the US at that time is. Every person in this story is either lost, murdered, or in jail. So this is the counter-history of the human and the counter-history of the trans. It isn't a happy story where a blonde woman undergoes a miraculous transformation, becomes a model, is the darling of the GIs, of the military, goes around doing a tour, which is the story of Christine Jorgensen, and American medicine pats itself on the back and says, "We're amazing." Okay, that's the story you get that culminates in Caitlyn Jenner. This is a completely other story. This is where we can trace our person to, they didn't get much education, they ended up in the school of truancy, which were used from about the 1920s all the way through to the 1980s for any black girls in particular who ran into trouble with the law, which is almost impossible not to. And that guarantees you, and in a way commits you to a life of drug dealing, because after that getting a respectable job would be very difficult. Okay, so I want to close this section then by returning to the journalist and what the journalist comments about this bisexuality of our person. We'll call them AC, which is the name that they settle on eventually. At the end of the story, the journalist says that he finally found someone still living who remembered AC, and it was a guy, it was a man called Doug, who had been involved with AC in the 1970s. And I want to see if I can find this quote. Where is it? All right, well, I'll just tell you about it. So, Doug was involved with AC for a year and comments that AC always dressed like a man and carried themselves like a man, and yet doesn't report any weirdness about the fact that he, a heterosexual man, was involved with this butch person. So what would that tell us? If we wanted to really read the archive, it would tell us that black heterosexuality potentially is very different from white heterosexuality and doesn't necessarily follow the same kinds of norms, and that black queerness is also quite different in formation than white queerness, and also doesn't rule out the possibility of multiple relations with multiple people of multiple genders without sensing that heterosexuality has been disrupted in any way. At the end of the interview, Doug says that the last time that they saw AC was picked up by a car, and the car door opened, and that he said that there were two butch-looking females in the car who grabbed AC, put AC in the car, and drove off. And Doug says that was the kind of person AC was. You never knew if you would ever see them again. Those were the kinds of people they hung out with. We don't really know what that means, other than, and nor does the journalist. Journalist has no idea what to do with this and just leaves it as a conclusion that just intensifies how weird this case is. But from a contemporary queer perspective, you could imagine that AC, and this is why I have this slide up, was part of at that time, what would have been called a black lesbian community made up of potentially in the 1970s, black butchers and black femmes. That was a world that was probably often criminalized, may well have been a drug dealing world, often in relationship to violence in a way that the white lesbian community of that time was not, okay? And it offers us the opportunity, again, to rethink even the story of gays and lesbians and gay and lesbian life in the US from this vantage point of the black body, okay? So in terms of that section, I guess what I'm trying to get at here is a completely different, potentially different set of narratives about black and queer bodies of color in the middle of the 20th century that have very different relationships to trans, very different relationships to gender variance, very different relationships to lesbianism, different relationships to futurity, criminality, civility, the police, the neighborhood, murder, violence, and so on. Okay? And just use it to put pressure on what we think we know about LGBTQ histories. Okay, so that's the first section. So having said that, I want to go back and revisit exactly the feminism, the white feminism, that we've understood in the contemporary period to be at odds with trans people. And I do so in order to, again, try to rewrite these conventional histories of trans feminisms that we've been satisfied with, that I think are present us with a problem. So the second section, I want to think about why we believe that feminism and trans is at odds, why we think of these movements as being at odds, and whether we can find any area of overlap, just as we did in this last history, and where the antipathy between trans and feminism comes from. And then I want to use a figure that probably no one here will have heard of, who was both a lesbian separatist and then 10 years later a female-to-male transsexual, and who was part of what has been cast as a trans-exclusionary feminism, but was also a trans person. And I found this person really, really easily. And in the research that I did for the trans book, I found lots and lots of discussions about transgenderism in the very feminist journals that we presume to be transphobic. So I really want to suggest, I'm not making any apologies for the transphobic feminisms, but I am saying that there are multiple feminisms out there, including black feminisms, that never were transphobic. The feminism of Audre Lorde, for example, the feminisms of the last slide that I showed you, and that it might be time to rethink this neat little narrative in which we pitch two radical groups against each other when there are much bigger enemies out there. So why do we think that feminists are anti-trans? This goes back to one book, really one book. The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male, which is a deeply offensive title, by a feminist, Janice Raymond, whom nobody reads anymore. Like nobody. Okay, the book came out in 1970. It was unsettling. It was violent in its language about trans women. It argued that trans women were trying to infiltrate lesbian separatist communities, that they were doing so at the behest of the US government, and that they were disguising themselves as women in order to enter these groups and then report back to the FBI. This is an incredible fantasy, like the FBI cared even slightly about a few little cells of lesbian separatists, right? Like, oh yeah, I mean, go back and look at the press of that time. No one was like, oh, these lesbian feminists, they're going to bring down the state. I mean, I wish that the state had been more worried about lesbian feminism, but it really wasn't. It really wasn't. These women were seen as kooks and crackpots and sad, lonely, miserable people, all the same kinds of critiques that lesbian feminists have always received. So Raymond was probably certifiably paranoid. There's probably, potentially she was psychologically unbalanced. I mean, it's one of the explanations for this book, because it's a nonsense book. But in a contemporary sense, trans women have seen this book as full of hate towards trans women, and have made it the cornerstone of an argument in which feminism is the main enemy to trans liberation. Okay, so to be honest with you, some 20 years later, Sandy Stone demolished this book, just demolished it. She is a transgender woman, an activist. She wrote a brilliant essay that rhymes on the whole transsexual empire thing, called it The Transsexual Empire Strikes Back, and calls Janice Raymond out for being absolutely ridiculous. And honestly, that was done. It was at the time that essay came out, everyone was like, okay, got it, done, moving on. It's only in the contemporary period that people have gone back and made the case for a trans-exclusionary feminism. And it is deeply damaging to left communities to be so divided in this way. And for a small wing of crackpot feminists to stand in for all feminists. They do not represent Latina feminists, they do not represent black feminists, they do not represent Asian feminists, they do not represent anything but a tiny group of women living in Boston in the 1970s and writing this hateful stuff. The books did not circulate widely then, they barely circulate now. That said, they were deeply hateful, and I'll give you a quote from them in a moment. The other site that was targeted as an example of trans-exclusionary feminism was Michigan Women's Music Festival. Have people heard of this festival? No? It was, yeah, this is a very American history, okay? So, unfortunately for the rest of the world, people have to care about American history because, America is so dominant in the way in which we talk about feminism and other things. And that's partly why I want to deconstruct this narrative, because I think that the fantasy of an opposition between feminism and transgenderism is traveling. And it's traveling separate from even a history of that thing being true in other places. Okay? The Michigan Women's Music Festival, for 25 years, from about the late 1960s to, I think it was the early 2000s, was a festival that could be attended by women only. Now, in the early days, nobody would have been policing whether, if you went as a trans woman and you didn't say anything about it, you went. No one was like checking genitalia, okay, at the door. But when some trans women arrived in the mid-90s and said that they were women too and they wanted to come to the festival, the festival instituted a policy of only post-operative women could come in because they wanted no penises at the festival. And of course, I mean, okay, this is, it's ridiculous. Some women said they didn't feel safe, and this created a massive backlash. This is the work that Sheila Jeffries and Janice Raymond did. You can see how hateful the rhetoric actually was. Janice Raymond said, all transsexuals rape women's bodies. Okay, all transsexuals rape women's bodies by literally trying to inhabit them, get inside of them, pretend to be them. And Sheila Jeffries suggested that transsexual surgery was like political psychiatry in the Soviet Union. She said transsexualism should be seen as a political medical abuse of human rights. The mutilation of healthy bodies and the subjection of such bodies to dangerous and life-threatening continuing treatment violates people's rights to live with dignity in the bodies to which they were born. In other words, anyone who gets any kinds of sex reassignment surgeries is being brainwashed by the state, right? Nonsense. But again, even in the 1980s, people thought of Sheila Jeffries as a crackpot. She had followers for sure, but she has not ever, nor did Janice Raymond ever have a kind of global presence as a meaningful feminist voice. That's more of Michigan. This is Alison Bechtel wrote a funny little comic strip suggesting that even lesbian feminists weren't so keen on Michigan Women's Festival. And here you have a clip of them returning from the festival saying, phew, that was fun, but 5 days is about as much nature and woman energy as I can stand. In other words, even the women who went to Michigan were ambivalent about being in women-only spaces. And that's actually an important thing to remember, that everyone wasn't on board with this women-born, women-only policy. So what happened was trans women in particular, but also Leslie Feinberg is there, a whole bunch of trans activists began boycotting Michigan Women's Music Festival. And this became a thing. And it was a terrible standoff between the women who continued to believe that they should be able to go to a place that there were no men for 2 weeks a year. But let me tell you another history about Michigan. Michigan was a place where lots and lots of queer bands played, lots of queer music. If you've ever heard of the punk band Tribe 8, 3 members of whom are now trans men, they played in Michigan. If you've ever heard of the punk band Bitch and Animal, they played at Michigan. If you've ever heard of the Indigo Girls, they played at Michigan. And often Michigan was the only place who would book these people. Annie DeFranco, she played at Michigan. They were not mainstream groups or singers. They did not make much money out in the real world, and Michigan gave them a platform both to sell their music, but also to get paid for playing at a festival. So when people started boycotting Michigan, they also boycotted all of these punk bands for whom Michigan was actually kind of a lifeline. So you kind of have to take that on as well and think about what that means. You're not just boycotting the woman who runs Michigan and says nobody with a penis can come in. You're boycotting a whole livelihood for artisans and for musicians and so on. This person is the person, though, that I want to talk about. She's a really significant, let's call her they. They are a very significant person in queer history, but is almost never, just as the first person I talked to you about, is never talked about in queer history. Okay? Their name is Maxine Feldman. Has anyone heard of Maxine Feldman? Nobody. So what we do a lot of times in queer history is we fix on people. Sylvia Rivera, right now we're talking about the people at Stonewall. We fix on the site of Stonewall as the place where something big happened. This person created a mini riot long before Stonewall. And I want to tell you about her because their song opened and closed Michigan every year. And it was a kind of an embarrassing song called Amazon Women. And it's exactly as you think, a sort of, herbal tea folk song about Amazon women weaving rainbows, and you're just like, oh my God, right? But they also had another song that I want to tell you about that I consider to be a punk song. They produced only one album, and that album came out long before Stonewall, and they toured with this album, and they were kicked off stage in California for performing the first openly lesbian or gay song on stage in the U.S. in 1969, a few months before Stonewall. So before this big event that we are mythologizing, one lone person, a trans person at that, person from Michigan Women's Music Festival, from that history, from that body of feminists, right, performed a song. She at the time was completely sick and tired of being harassed by the police in gay bars, being beaten up by homophobes, and so on, and went on stage, having written the song the night before, and played the song, and was arrested. And I want to play you the song, which, this is just a quick version of her life. Here they are later on in life as Max Feldman. Towards the end of their life, they took testosterone, lived as a trans man, according to their partner, but early on played women's music. And you can see that this person took testosterone. There's an effect of 5 o'clock shadow and a masculinized face and so on. They understood themselves to be a radical feminist. They called themselves butch. They understood themselves to be a loud Jewish lesbian and a transgender man. And all of those things can be true at the same time. So this is my big pitch, is that we hold in place at the same time lots of different truths that make much more complicated histories than the ones that we settle for under the categories of identity that we've settled on. Okay? So this person can be part of a movement that seems as trans-exclusionary, but later on be trans, but also be a lesbian, but also be a feminist, and also have nearly incited a riot that has been completely forgotten from the history books. So this is the album. It's called Closet Sale. In it, Maxine Feldman is wearing a tuxedo. The tuxedos are a super interesting feature of queer history for masculine women, because tuxedos are the one man costume that men wear that come in multiple sizes. Why? Because men tend to get fitted for tuxedos for weddings and funerals and other occasions like that. So every tuxedo is custom made. So for Butch, who's looking for men's suits to wear, the tuxedo is a really good one. And going back through queer history, we find lots and lots of images of butches or trans men wearing tuxedos. So I just want to point that out. I'll give you another image of that later. Right now, though, I want to play you what I consider to be this big punk song that should be memorialized as the beginning of a particular history, a history that we haven't wanted to tell, the counter-history of the human, the history of waywardness, and so on. It's called Angry at This. Hold on. And it is written first as a sort of folky song, but then as it builds in tempo and rhythm, you will see that it has a kind of punk orientation. We'll go back to it. Because now it sounds like we have it.
I hate not being able to hold my lover's hand, set under some dimly lit table, afraid of being who I am. I hate to tell my
Certainly not when I came out, which was, about 10 years after this song. A lot of gay bars were simply places that you had to go if you wanted to meet somebody, and they were full of alcoholics and of lonely people drinking. And that's the version of the gay bar that you get here. Feel like we're animals in cages, she says. And have you seen the lights in the gay bar? They're always low. You always meet people in the dark. You meet randomly and anonymously. That's, a tough queer context. And that's a context that deserves its own kind of counter-history, one that is not part of this glorified history of trans-liberation that we keep dating to Stonewall and then pulling forward to gay marriage. It's part of a much more complex, politically fraught and radical moment, one that gave rise to the final movement that I want to discuss in my talk by way of conclusion. Those are just some more tuxedo butches, trans and architecture. And I'm going to use this to conclude, so as not to leave us just like lost in history with people whose stories can't be recovered, people who are lost, people who die with no trace, people who are not represented as part of queer history, and so on. So by conclusion, I want to turn to a really different art movement from that very moment, from the first person AC, killed in 1974, Maxine Feldman, this song 1969. This architecture movement was a queer, but not only queer movement in New York City, of a group of artists, including Laurie Anderson, probably most famously, but mostly associated with the work of Gordon Matta Clark, a Chilean by birth, a Chilean architect, who decided that the way to fight back against the status quo was to engage in an unbuilding of the world around them. And so they, this is a queer author who writes about queer architecture and describes transness as perpetual transition. There are a few other things. So here's the picture of the group. The Architecture group were a group of artists who set about to unbuild the status quo in New York City itself. They did so in a number of different ways. One, they had a project called Food, in which anyone who needed food and anyone who had food would show up at a space in the East Village and people would eat together. So to remap the way in which people experience community in this very anarchist way that we could easily learn from, right, and that many contemporary artists continue to do. Wu Sang is a queer trans artist who has a project in which they made meals for people people, and people would show up and eat them. Recognizing that we all live together in city spaces where some people are hungry and some people throw food away, and yet there are no mechanisms for bringing those two groups together. This is one of Gordon Matta Clark's most famous works. Gordon Matta Clark believed that the city, real estate, and architecture combined to basically weight political life in favor of the wealthy, the white, and the middle class. So what he did in 1974, he bought a house that was falling apart in the suburbs that was victim to one of these boom-bust economies in real estate. He bought the house for nothing, and he decided to split it down the middle. This is his art project. It's called Splitting. And I know it seems sort of ridiculous and nonsensical, but if you think about what a house is the building block of heteronormativity. You know, in the way the rooms are divided up, that there's a master bedroom, and then other bedrooms, that there's a living room and a dining room and a basement. All of that is, that architecture represents in idealized form the nuclear family and its predominance in modern industrialized societies. So what does he do? He takes a chainsaw and he cuts a line down the middle of the house, having already jacked the house up at the back, so that when the architecture falls apart, it also falls back, and it just assumes this incredible shape with a split down the middle. When asked about it, he said that the real difficulty with this maneuver is to get the house to come apart, but not collapse. Okay? So that's what we're doing here. We want to cut into the structures that hold us in place and take them to the point where, instead of collapsing, they split open and we can see the structures inside. So for me, this is a fantastic art movement, and they just show you some other pieces because he's amazing. Gordon Matta Clark went and cut into the Chelsea piers. The piers were places where, for those of us in the class, Paris is Burning, a lot of the young kids in Paris is Burning would be hanging out on the piers in the 70s. The shipping industry had failed, and these piers that run the length of the Hudson River were places that homeless youth would go, queer youth would go to cruise, and drug dealers would go to score and to deal drugs. Matta Clark went there and cut these gorgeous semicircles into the piers, arguing in a utopian way that everyone should come to this space and everyone should be able to experience the architecture as beautiful, as a combination of light and water. And the architecture wasn't only for the wealthy and the rich and the museums and the people who have redesigned their homes, but it should be for everyone. So he tries to innovate this an-architectural cut and transform an abandoned site into a beautiful public space. I don't know if I have, okay. So just to show you the influence that I believe I can track onto queer artists, I'll give you two final images of queer artists who I believe are an-architectural. This is a queer body artist called Castles. Castles built a masculine body for themselves, not by taking hormones, but from the age of 15, by building their body in a gym. And they now do performances in which they create sculptures, not by beautifully carving a shape out of clay, but by hurling themselves against the clay repeatedly until the clay is a damaged mass, bearing all the imprints of contact. And they themselves are destroyed and damaged and beaten up by their contact with the clay. So it's an unbuilding both of the body and of the clay. And then finally, an artist with whom I often collaborate, Boychild, who performs these sort of wild dystopian dances that are most clearly related to Buto, which is a Japanese art form. Buto means the dance of death or the dance of the grotesque. And they participate in performances with a Thai artist, Kurakrit, who creates apocalyptic landscapes that seem as if they are, you know, what happens after the human. And Boychild performs this kind of post-human becoming and crawls out of the wreckage and then does these strange of the unmade, unbuilt world. So rather than, just leave an architecture stranded there in the 1970s, I want to offer then for discussion the first example I gave you as a counter history of the human, these black histories of gender variance and queerness that are almost completely absent from the archives we've settled on. The middle section, which is about a fusing of transgender and feminist history, a place where they do not come apart and are not opposed, but are actually part of the same radical mission. And then finally, this beautiful, amazing project, this anarchistic project of unbuilding the world in which all of these relations take place in favor of a kind of apocalyptic aftermath in which we'll all be queer or monstrous or unmade or nothing or something.
Thank you very much. And I'll send the floor on to you with questions, comments, anything. Please.
So I tried to be a bit provocative, to push for, different kinds of histories, and you might want to push back, disagree, or have some counter histories of your own to offer.
Yeah. So I have a comment and a question. I live in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm a grad student at faculty at ASU. I'm living in the US in the last year.
Yeah.
And do you think nowadays in the US, black feminism, there's like a movement of black feminism? Do you think nowadays after Trump, when Trump is there, we see that? Because in Arizona, I don't see much of that. I see more a Latin feminist movement.
Yeah.
Because we're next to Mexico. I used to live in the Northwestern before, and I didn't see much of it. It was great what you were presenting, but what do you think about black feminist or black lesbian movement nowadays?
Yeah,
Because
definitely.
you are in the other side of the country where I
Look,
am.
the race is really regionalized in the U.S., so in Arizona, exactly as you say, these are much more Latinx queer movements, and movements that are in their very origin in transnational movements. The Latina feminist movement in the U.S. has always been connected to third world movements in the 60s and 70s. They've always been multilingual, transnational, not at all the movement of these white feminists that are being represented as all feminists. See, this is the paradox. It's when you say, there are all these trans-exclusionary feminists, but they're all white women. Most of them, they're white women. We're centering, again, one small piece of a much larger feminist movement. Black feminism is all over the place, in fact, right now. The Black Lives Matter movement, the leadership of Black Lives Matter are black lesbians. So it's not so hard to find examples of black feminism in the U.S. today. What's more important here is that there's a very long history of black feminism. We mentioned the name of Audre Lorde, but Audre Lorde was embedded in a much larger group of black women. Again, white women tend to pull significant figures out and make it seem as if there's just one or two such people, when in fact Audre Lorde at that time was part of was in relation to the Combahee River Collective, which was a sort of anarchist group of black women feminists who, again, were in touch transnationally with other third world liberation movements. It's only white feminism in the context of the U.S. that was very narrowly focused on gender equality. So I think one of the provocations here is to rethink feminism, trans issues, queer issues in relationship to women-powered feminism, and stop treating white feminism as if it tells the entire story. Now, I did use a white feminist in Maxine Feldman, but she understood herself very clearly at the time as a Jewish feminist, and in the 60s that was a more significant category than it might be today. It was still a category that understood itself to be precarious and so on. Yes, there are lots and lots of movements in particularly northeastern cities and in LA as well of black feminism.
Yeah, because I attended the Women's March in January or February,
Yeah.
that. So, and I saw a particular group of queer women there in the march, but I didn't see a black queer.
Okay. Why do you think that is?
I have no idea. That's my question. I was wondering why is it? Did they lose their black identity? I don't think so. So, because they were mixed, black, white, or Latino, everybody all together. So,
But you say it was everyone together, but no black women. Is that what you're saying?
no, they were black women, but together with white women and everybody as a queer group.
Okay.
I didn't see any separation between black queer or white queer or
Right. But the
Latina
Women's
queer.
March, the Women's March is also being critiqued for all kinds of, for making one narrative out of many narratives, let's put it that way. But for the most part, if anyone can be united around anything, it's the hatred of Trump right now. And people did come together, trans feminists, black feminists, but lots of black feminists were critical of the Women's March as, again, a kind of liberal feminist move. A lot of black women are deeply angry in the wake of the election because of the fact that in the U.S., 55% of white women voted for Trump. That's really significant when we're continuing to focus in on white feminism. White feminism is a problem, as it turns out, not a solution, because a lot of women in the Women's March maintained their support of Hillary Clinton. Well, lots of people of color didn't show up to vote, precisely because they didn't see Hillary Clinton as their candidate. And that's something that the Women's March really doesn't acknowledge. You know, the Women's March is just like, we're the Hillary people who have been marginalized by this, right-wing movement to elect Trump. Well, you couldn't have elected Trump without the votes of 55% of white women and the suppression of the votes of people of color. So I wouldn't be fooled by seeing lots of, a multicultural array of people at the Women's March. That doesn't mean much. Yeah.
I was just thinking about what kind of new political grammar goes with this unbuilding of words, because it seems to me that, like the political grammar that we have, like maybe identity politics right now, doesn't capture this wildness or disorderly word that you're presenting to us. So which kind of new language goes with this?
Perfect. Great question. Exactly right. Why, are there other grammars and languages that we can use? And I really love that you use the word grammar as well, because Gordon Matter Clark, an architect guy, he understood architecture as a kind of grammar, a grammar of the built environment. And, buildings do work that way. So almost like, you look at an urban landscape and you expect to see certain things in certain places, and you expect to see a certain shape for the house, and even when you're in the house, you expect the house to be divided up into rooms in certain ways. Even very architecturally innovative houses have the master bedroom with the master bathroom and so on. So he trained, Gordon Matter Clark, he trained as an architect at Cornell and then set out to destroy architecture. That was his goal. He's like, I'm going to take everything I just learned and I'm going to unbuild this world that is so invested in architecture. And just think about the fact that one of the darlings of the New Right, not only in the US but elsewhere, is Ayn Rand, the author of The Fountainhead, whose main protagonist is an architect. And Ayn Rand was a writer who deeply influenced lots of people on the right wing, because her argument was people who are successful in society are not simply the recipients of enormous privilege and advantages. They're special people. Why do they excel? Because they're special. It's almost like a cult. Ayn Rand is almost saying like if somebody does well, like Bush or Trump, we see the reality of this. Trump did do well because he was special. He did well because he was handed $1 million for his 18th birthday. and massive corporations that he could benefit from his entire life, right? The Ayn Rand read of that would be, he's part of a special family that has engineered its own success. And her image for that, the architect. So our image, to refuse that and to offer another grammar, is the an-architect, the person who comes into the city and wants to unbuild the ways in which the city represents its dominant interests. It's no accident today that global cities are marked by investment in real estate, right? In Madrid, in New York, in Hong Kong, in Vancouver, in Tokyo, in vast landscapes in China. People who have massive amounts of money are investing in building luxury buildings that no one will live in. They're called zombie architectures. Zombie architectures, because they're built not so that somebody can have a home, but so that an investor can have a place to put their money. Because the worst thing for a capitalist is to have money that's not in circulation. Money that's in your bank account is taxable. So money has to go elsewhere. Surplus is a problem in capitalism. It's as much a problem as a deficit. It's why right-wingers always work with deficits and not with surpluses. Okay? So the real estate markets we live in that we can no longer afford are that way because we have a very small percentage of the global population with all the wealth. They need to invest it somewhere. So this is the right moment for an architecture. We should be tearing this shit down. You know, we have, I was in LA the other week. LA has 59,000 homeless people. 59,000. That's just the people that they've counted. I could see driving around that there must be hundreds of thousands more. In parts of LA, entire streets are tents, just tents. People just stretched out in sleeping bags. So this one student said, could she do a performance instead of presenting a paper? So I said, okay, yeah, do a performance, that's great. So she's got someone waiting out in the hall, I don't really know who, and at the end of the class she comes in with this person who basically is a stripper, is dressed as a stripper. Great, I'm okay with that. And they come in, they throw lighter fluid into a trash can and set it on fire. Okay, so the first thing is I've got a burning trash can in the classroom. Then they pull out of their bag pieces of meat, raw meat, throw it on the walls. I'm like, okay, this is interesting. And then the student who'd asked to do the presentation, so let's say we're in a classroom like this, gets up on this table and begins doing a kind of very sexualized dancing. She has no underwear on, she has a dildo in her hand. This is a class of freshmen, and I'm looking around. And I think some of these students probably haven't even had sex yet, you know, it's Yale. And this is year 2 of a gay and lesbian program. It was just called the LG program at that point. And I was worried, like if this gets out, this program is done. It's done. But I really didn't want to be, the censoring person. Like, it didn't particularly affect me. But I had to stop the performance, and I had to sort of usher these freshmen out, and sure enough, I was called into the dean's office the next day. And my argument to the woman who was like, well, you said you wanted queer disorderliness, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, true, you know. But my point was, it's actually pretty easy to disrupt a classroom. Go and disrupt a House of Parliament. Go and disrupt a bank. Go and disrupt the square. Go and disrupt a restaurant. In the classroom, you know, we think we know who's supposed to be speaking at any given time or who's supposed to be doing what. So, yeah, on the one hand, the university needs to be shaken up for sure. But I'm not entirely sure how to do it. What I am is dismayed by the way in which young people in classrooms depict themselves all the time as offended and as triggered. You know, that's something that I've written about a little bit. To me, that's not anarchistic at all. To be offended by everything and to be triggered by everything, I don't think that's anarchistic. I think that actually moves in the opposite direction towards wanting more order and more control and more rigidity and more emphasis on morality and appropriateness and all of these things. So, you know, when some of us began teaching some 20, 25 years ago, we had to fight to have classes on pornography. We had to fight to have classes in which we talked about rape and sexual assault.